I've been doing a newsletter, which is sort of like my, I used to have a Sunday column that was a grab bag of things, and this newsletter that I do, it's called the Picayune Sentinel. It comes out every Thursday. You can look for that online, or you can just email me. I'm Eric Zorn at Gmail, and I can put you on a list, and you can see if you like it. It's free on Thursdays, and I go through a lot. I opine on things of city, state, local, national interest, and sports sometimes, and music sometimes. The publication is named for a mimeographed sheet that my grandfather produced. He was in the math department at Indiana University, and he loved to communicate with his colleagues, and the Picayune Sentinel was 1 or 2 pages of math in-jokes. And I still have copies of most of them, and I can't understand any of them. It was in honor of my grandfather. I named my new paper the Picayune Sentinel. Free speech in an overly censored world is the topic, the title of what I'm going to talk about tonight. And I want to preface my remarks by saying that there are obviously worse problems in the world than people who feel intimidated and frightened to express their perfectly conventional and reasonable and sometimes even politically popular views for fear that they're going to be harassed and shamed and ostracized or punished. The brutal sociopathic Russian attack on civilians in Ukraine is the most obvious example of a more serious problem. So I'm conscious of a voice in my head saying, not now, to talk about this little problem, but I'm preparing tonight to defend the idea of discourse. I also want to note, as I get going, that though the term cancel culture is heard a lot in debates on this topic, I try to navigate around that term. It's such a lightning rod. It's one that's misunderstood and it's weaponized, and it tends to generate much more heat than it does shed light. So I feel the same way about the word woke, which in its original meaning in the Black vernacular meant having a heightened sense of awareness of racial justice, as in Stay Woke, which was the title of a 2016 documentary on the Black Lives Matter movement. But the word woke pretty quickly got hijacked by the right. It became basically a slur, or what they say, a linguistic eye roll, deployed to suggest earnest, performative, liberal excess and hypersensitivity. There is no crisper sneer at the looniest and most vindictive pronouncements of my most insufferable friends on the left than to call them woke. So I'm trying to avoid that word for now. Anyway, I want to start by discussing 2 recent essays in the New York Times. The first was an op-ed by University of Virginia senior named Emma Camp. She's a self-styled liberal, and the essay appeared under the headline, "I came to college eager to debate. I found self-censorship instead." And in this essay, Camp decried the strict ideological conformity that effectively silences students and professors on campus who have views that are outside the progressive mainstream. Her argument was, I'm quoting from her here, "In the classroom, backlash for unpopular opinions is so commonplace that many students have stopped voicing them, sometimes fearing lower grades if they don't censor themselves." According to a 2021 survey administered by College Pulse of over 37,000 students at 159 colleges, 48% of these students describe themselves as somewhat uncomfortable or very uncomfortable with expressing their views on a controversial topic in the classroom. Emma Camp noted that when criticism transforms into public shaming, it stifles learning. And as if on cue to prove her point, the more enlightened than thou crowd that declines to acknowledge the suffocating quality of liberal orthodoxy on many college campuses, they proceeded to attempt to shame her with a barrage of mocking, insulting tweets online. A very similar outcry followed an editorial that was published a few days later in the New York Times, headlined, "America Has a Free Speech Problem." In an editorial, they said, many on the left refuse to acknowledge that cancel culture exists at all, believing that those who complain about it are offering cover for bigots to peddle hate speech. Many on the right, for all their braying about cancel culture, have embraced an even more extreme version of censoriousness as a bulwark against a rapidly changing society with laws that would ban books, stifle teachers, and discourage open discussion in classrooms. Many Americans are understandably confused then about what they can say and when they can say it. People should be able to put forward viewpoints, ask questions, and make mistakes, take unpopular but good faith positions on issues that society is still working through, all without fear of cancellation, said the New York Times. The Times quoted from a new national poll commissioned by Times Opinion and Siena College, finding that 84% of adults say it is a very serious or somewhat serious problem that some Americans do not speak freely in everyday situations because they fear retaliation or harsh criticism. How bad is that problem on individual campuses? Well, I have a funny story. On April 7th, a few weeks ago, the University of Wisconsin system was set to send out a free speech survey to all undergraduates asking such questions as, how often do your professors create a classroom climate in which people with unpopular views would feel comfortable sharing their opinions? Questions like, how often have you felt pressured by a professor to agree with a specific political or ideological opinion being expressed in class? And questions like, think about the times you wanted to speak up in class about a controversial issue but decided not to. Why did you not speak up? Check any reasons that apply. Well, this survey was abruptly canceled. Supposedly just postponed for the fall, but probably canceled, because students and faculty and critics said that it wasn't well designed. It looked like conservative legislators might use the results to craft laws cracking down on the speech, and that other issues such as diversity and mental health of students were more important. Now, I think that those reasons may be somewhat valid, but what they really wanted was to stop the survey because it almost certainly would have underscored what Emma Camp wrote and what those national polls have found, and what the Times said in its editorial, that there is an oppressive orthodoxy on college campuses that impedes the historical and important mission of academia to ask questions, to challenge ideas, and through that forge new consensuses. Exposing the power of orthodoxy threatens to weaken that power, and they want no part in it. Now, there was, of course, a rich irony in the New York Times twisting its handkerchief over the allegations of the informal right to make mistakes and take good faith positions that might be unpopular. This is the same newspaper that in 2020 forced opinion editor James Bennett to resign for publishing an op-ed by Arkansas Republican Senator Tom Cotton, advocating for the use of the U.S. military to restore order amid the national riots following the murder of George Floyd. And it's the same newspaper whose editors drummed out of the newsroom Donald McNeil Jr., a highly respected veteran science and public health reporter, because he mentioned a highly toxic racial slur in asking a student a question about it, to a high school student. He didn't use the slur. He, as many headlines put it, he spoke the word in a context that recognized that it was a particularly hurtful term. Now, was Donald McNeil's mistake a good faith mistake? Almost certainly. There was no racist intent behind his mention of the word, no history of racist acts or deeds in his past that would have made this the final straw. Or was it a good faith mistake for Bennett to publish an essay by a United States senator taking a position I'm sure that tens of millions of Americans shared, and that 64% of respondents to a later poll said they thought the Times should have published, even if they didn't agree with it? To show another side of a public policy debate, one held by a person who was in a position to shape public policy. Now let's say that it was. Let's say that the opinion was irresponsibly extreme. The New York Times of March 2022, last month, would say that the remedy was immediately to publish a strong, well-argued counterpoint to Senator Cotton's view, not to ashcan the opinion editor. So while I take the Times editorial with a shovelful of salt, and I think the writer erred in saying it was a fundamental right to speak in public without fear of being shamed, I believe it's undeniable that what we've reached in a place in our civic life that criticism too easily elides into punishment. And where ordinary people, not necessarily famous or overly privileged people, fear the long-term consequences of of giving voice to views that may well also be shared by millions of well-meaning, moral people. Just for example, after the Times editorial appeared, liberal journalist Dan Frumkin, who's editor of Press Watch, called for the resignation of the entire editorial board of the New York Times, a call that actually underscored the problem that the Times was attempting to identify, an authoritarian impulse to suppress, not just criticize, but to suppress certain mainstream viewpoints, to attempt to deprive those who advance such views of their livelihoods. Frumkin wrote, "We need more shaming and shunning, not less." Now, critics of these two pieces in the Times almost all came from the left, which is generally my side of the political spectrum, and they fall into three camps. In one camp, these critics are the deniers, those who say that all this fretting about speech and expression is much ado about very little, a form of moral panic fueled by anecdotes that are often inaccurate, usually overblown, cynically amplified by people who just can't take criticism. In another camp are the justifiers. The justifiers admit that yes, people are being dogpiled on social media for heterodox views, they're being denied jobs and opportunities, but they deserve it. The harshly personal attacks and other attempts to silence and shame, fire, bully, and deplatform those espousing purported heresies is merely consequence culture, that we basically call it. And so it's nothing to worry about. Those who are punished for their ideas richly deserve it. And in the third camp are the whatabouters, those who say that we shouldn't be calling out Democrats and liberals for heavy-handed tactics in an effort to squelch speech that they disagree with, because Republicans and conservatives are far more aggressive and punitive, and therefore a far greater threat to free speech. Now I'll talk about each of these camps again. The deniers. The deniers misunderstand the situation, at least they pretend they do. Sure, the number of people who've actually lost their jobs, lost income, and suffered the sorts of social banishment that might qualify as true cancellation, that number is small. Many of them had and still have positions of influence and privilege, and simply have had to endure a few unpleasant days of being called names and ridiculed on social media. Still, each such story, each such person who's lost job, lost face, lost reputation, has a viral impact on others. Let's consider Dorian Abbott. He's a distinguished geophysicist at the University of Chicago. And the Massachusetts Institute of Technology invited him to give a public lecture last fall about his work in the area of climate change. He's a noted climate scientist. Then all hell broke loose because Abbott, who is white, is an opponent of affirmative action. Those are the measures that are designed to advance the diversity, equity, and inclusion at academic institutions. He and an accounting professor at Stanford wrote an opinion essay in Newsweek last August, and that essay said, and I quote, that diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts violate the ethical and legal principle of equal treatment. They entail treating people as members of a group rather than individuals, repeating the mistake that made possible the atrocities of the 20th century. DEI, diversity, inclusion, and diversity, equity, inclusion, measures compromise the university's mission. The core business of the university is the search for truth. The university's intellectual environment depends fundamentally on its commitment to hiring the most talented and best trained minds. Any departure, he wrote, any departure from this commitment must come at the expense of academic excellence, and ultimately will compromise the university's contribution to society. Now, whether you agree or disagree with Professor Abbott's views on racial preferences in hiring and admission is not, the point is that his is in fact a debatable proposition. It's a proposition that is, at the very least, in the mainstream of American political thought. 2018 survey from the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago found 72% of U.S. adults oppose giving preferences to Black Americans in hiring and promotion. 2019 Pew Research Center survey found 73% of Americans say colleges and universities should not consider race or ethnicity when making admissions decisions. Last November, California voters defeated by a 56 to 44% margin a proposal that would have allowed race and gender considerations to be a factor in public employment, education, and contracting. It may have been November of 2020, now that I think of it. Pew also found in 2019 that 75% of Americans agree that it's very or somewhat important for companies and organizations to promote racial and ethnic diversity in their workplaces. And earlier this year, when Gallup asked vaguely about affirmative action programs for racial minorities, they got 62% support. So no matter how you analyze such data, you simply cannot deny that affirmative action is an issue on which reasonable people do disagree. But MIT was having none of that. The university canceled Abbott's lecture in the face of complaints similar to those that he received at UChicago, that his very presence threatened the, quote, safety and belonging of all underrepresented groups. Now, Dorian Abbott will be fine. As an associate professor, he almost certainly has tenure. And anyone who hears this story about the MIT campus and on UChicago campus now knows that they should think twice or three times before giving voice to an opinion on affirmative action that cuts against the progressive grain, even though it is demonstrably a mainstream position. People without tenure, people who are hoping for a foothold in academia, people who simply want to enjoy membership in the university community without being branded and reviled as a racist, all of them will know to avoid giving voice to this opinion. They're going to shut the hell up. The price of attempting to engage in a civil debate about affirmative action and DEI initiatives is simply too high. So that debate doesn't happen. The caucus that promotes more shaming and shunning, can do the end zone dance of victory. And this brings me to camp number 2, the justifiers, the ones who say that those who hold terrible views or make regrettable mistakes in the words they use deserve the punishment that they get. They should suffer consequences for amplifying the unacceptable. Now, there are points of view, political and social positions that are so toxic and marginal that they should be shamed and shunned. I would say that Holocaust denial is one of them. White supremacy, the promotion of pedophilia, calls for murder, hateful use of racial and ethnic slurs. There are probably a few others I'm not thinking of that are outside the boundaries established by the expression reasonable people can differ. I'm not so sure that actively, noisily denying advocates of such views any platform to address a willing audience is a smarter tactic than simply ignoring them. But if shaming and shunning works in such instances to discourage others from advocating such views, I'll allow it, as a judge might say. But what we're seeing is an ongoing effort to shift legitimate policy disagreements, areas in which polling shows 30 or 40%, or even a majority of the public, holds a certain view. Yet the censorious mob decrees that such a view must be put in the same category as Holocaust denial. And here I'm going to briefly tell the story of Mike Pesca, who's the Slate broadcaster who was suspended indefinitely a little more than a year ago for making the argument in an internal company Slack channel that there are some cases where it's okay for a white person to say the N-word when, for example, quoting another speaker or reading from a passage from Huckleberry Finn. Not to use the N-word as a racial slur, but to quote it. And in the course of this debate with his colleagues, this private debate on Slack channel, the internal communication system, Pesca did not type or use the full word. He was suspended. First it was for a couple of weeks, then it was indefinitely. Ultimately, he had to part ways with Slate, and he was away from podcasting for nearly a year for making an argument in a private Slack channel, an argument with which I've come to disagree, actually. I think it's a word that we should avoid as much as we possibly can. I don't agree with Mike on that, but I do think that it was well within bounds for debate. Now, was his loss of a job, loss of reputation? I talked to Mike at one point and asked him how things were going, and he told me that things were going really well for him, except that he couldn't find advertisers for his attempt to restart his podcast. That has since faded away, and he has been able to find some advertisers. He's starting it up again. I recommend it. You listen to The Gist on your podcast app. Mike's very, very smart. Now, I'm not sure how close I came to losing my job at the Tribune a year ago this month for presenting an inbounds argument on a touchy subject, but a vociferous group of indignant people called for my professional head after I wrote a column after the police killing of a 13-year-old boy in Chicago, Adam Toledo, in Chicago's Little Village neighborhood. You probably remember that story. It happened at 2:38 in the morning on Monday, March 29th, 2021. Police had responded to reports of gunshots fired. They chased Adam, who was carrying a gun, down an alley, and they killed him. A police officer killed him with one shot to the chest. That's what was known to the public at the time that I wrote the column. About a week after this fact, I wrote that it was a tragedy, no matter what the circumstances were. The lot has gone wrong when a 13-year-old ends up fleeing from police in the middle of the night with a gun in his hand. But I wasn't sure yet that it was an outrage, whether that it was necessarily another example of unjustified police violence against people of color. Activists had already decided that yes, it was. They were marching in the streets in protest. Black Lives Matter tweeted, "There is absolutely no justification for murdering our children." Organized Communities Against Deportation tweeted out a drawing of Adam Toledo with angel's wings and a halo over his head, accompanied by a statement reading, "There are no instances where murderous violence against a child is justified." And I want to emphasize, this was before any body cam video had come out showing the exact circumstances of this quote-unquote armed confrontation the police were describing. Now, I think it's the sacred duty of not just a newspaper columnist, but a citizen to step back when emotions are really high and say, wait a second, what do we know to be true? What do we just think might be true? Before we convict a police officer of murder in the court of public opinion, shouldn't we apply the same tests of fairness and make the same demands for evidence that we would if we ourselves were ever to be accused of a crime? I wrote that activists and concerned community members were right to keep the heat on for answers, but it was too early to say that this was murder, and it was not too early to stop romanticizing and infantilizing 13-year-old kids. 13-year-old kids can be dangerous. I cited 5 examples in this column of 13-year-olds who've been charged with murder in the U.S. in just the previous 6 months. I wrote these charges against other very young defendants don't necessarily tell us anything about the victim in this case, but they do suggest that using his age as shorthand for innocence and harmlessness as proof of the depravity of the police officer is not fair. A 13-year-old with a gun is as dangerous as a 23-year-old with a gun or a 33-year-old with a gun, maybe even more dangerous given what we know about the lack of judgment and impulse control in adolescence. In fact, I wrote, it's the very lack of judgment in still developing brains that inspires the hope for growth, reform, and redemption that undergirds the concept of juvenile justice itself. It's what renders it immoral to impose life sentences on young offenders. Now, in retrospect, the column had sort of a chilly tone that didn't adequately reflect the enormity of the tragedy that was being felt in that community, the death of someone so young. And I apologize in print for the tone of that. But I concluded that column by arguing that it's not too early to ask how we can better support young people, all people, in economically disadvantaged communities. It's not too early to ask what employment, educational, recreational opportunities we can offer to give them better paths to success, to ask what treatments and interventions will reduce the number of such shattering incidents that have a kid that young carrying a gun through the streets of Chicago in the middle of the night. Well, I was buried for this column on social media, with the central allegation being that I was defending the murder of a child, almost certainly because the child was not white, even though my column never mentioned his race or his ethnicity. And those howling from my head didn't know that I've championed liberal causes for decades, and my first big story about the flaws of the death penalty was a lengthy investigation that cleared 2 Hispanic defendants in a 1983 rape and murder of a child. It later implicated a white defendant who was later tried and convicted for that same murder. I'd also written columns demanding a review of the so-called Ford Heights 4 case, a quartet of African-American men who were wrongfully convicted in the 1978 double murder of a white couple, and defendant Juan Rivera, a Hispanic man wrongfully convicted of the 1992 rape and murder of an 11-year-old white babysitter. This did not matter to the people who wanted me out. In September of last year, the DePaulia, the student newspaper at DePaul University, published an opinion essay by 2 of the paper's news editors, declaring that it was inappropriate that I'd been invited to participate in an upcoming campus panel discussion called Tough Times for Local Journalism. The reason was that I had, quote, expressed racist views about Latinx youth and shown great insensitivity toward police brutality, Selecting Zorn to speak at DePaul shows students of color that the school has regard for their physical or mental well-being. We believe that hate speech should not be allowed on campus because it can put students at risk of vulnerable situations. Now, anytime you hear the safety argument used as an excuse to put a sock in someone's mouth, an alarm should go off in your head. Remember the Dorian Abbott story, the UFC professor. MIT justified canceling his lecture on climate change because his presence threatened the, quote, safety and the belonging of all underrepresented groups. Can actual hate speech put certain individuals in danger? Yeah, but categorizing mainstream ideas or opinions with which one does not agree as hate speech puts the entire concept of rational discourse in what we call a vulnerable situation. Rational discourse is how we settle differences. It's how we edge toward compromise and devise ways of living together in a society in which we inevitably have different opinions about important things. Political orthodoxy, political fundamentalism, it says either you are 100% with us or you are a heretic. That's toxic to the functioning of a free society. Do you have any questions or misgivings about when and whether trans women and those born male who have transitioned to female can compete in women's sports or be housed in women's prisons or admitted to women's domestic violence shelters? If you have such questions, you're likely to be called a hater. Even if you're otherwise totally fine with respecting gender identity, using preferred pronouns, championing equal rights in housing and employment, if you're not all the way, then you're transphobic, even though you're not alone. Gallup poll in May found 62% of respondents say transgender individuals should have to compete with and against athletes of their birth gender. Now, this is a more complicated issue, a question that either side seems willing to admit, and I'm of the view that accommodations and compromises can level that playing field. But acting as though the view of 62% of Americans, according to Gallup, is so wrong, so out of bounds, as not to be debatable, is in fact an extreme position. And that position should be marginalized. When I was reviled for my Adam Toledo column, it was unpleasant, I admit. I lost some sleep over it, primarily because I was out of town at the time, and I was a little worried that some of those inflamed critics would literally bring their complaints to my doorstep. Protesting at people's homes has become a thing. I don't know if you saw in Chicago today that a bunch of angry staffers at the Chicago Reader were protesting at the home in East Lakeview of the co-owner of the paper, objecting to what he had done. And I agreed completely with their position, and I disagree almost completely with their decision to protest outside his house. The boundaries between public and private are crumbling. Consider the protesters who followed Arizona Senator Kristen Sinema into a public bathroom last October to confront her over her obstructionist policies. Now, I lost sleep over that column. I didn't lose my job. My editor stood beside me, despite the turmoil in the newsroom from colleagues who turned on me. But not everyone who's dogpiled on Twitter is so lucky. Consider Howard Faulkner, the editor of the Journal of American Medicine in Chicago. He was forced to resign because, and see if you can follow this, the host of a JAMA podcast that Faulkner was not on, the host of a podcast sponsored by his organization, offered on that podcast the opinion that poorer health outcomes for African Americans are, quote, more of a socioeconomic phenomenon that evidences structural racism in society. This is heterodox, not just controversial, but heretical in the eyes of some. The podcast host was forced to resign from his position at the magazine, and then Faulkner, groveling obsequiously about his ultimate responsibility and muling that he was, quote, profoundly disappointed in himself, he was nevertheless also shown the door. Or consider this story, also from Chicago. In early 2020, a little more than a week after George Floyd was murdered, many cities were roiling with protests over racism. The Chicago-based Poetry Foundation put out a statement. I'm going to read you this statement in full. It's not long. The Poetry Foundation and Poetry Magazine stand in solidarity with the Black community and denounce injustice and systemic racism. As an organization, we recognize that there is much work to be done, and we are committed to engaging in this work to eradicate institutional racism. We acknowledge that real change takes time and dedication, and we are committed to making this a priority. We believe in the strength and power of poetry to uplift in times of despair, it concludes, and to empower and amplify the voices of this time, of this moment. That's the statement. Now, do you see the problem with it? The offense that prompted some 1,800 outraged people to sign an open letter demanding the resignations of the foundation president and board of directors, well, that statement was, quote, worse than the bare minimum because, quote, given the stakes, which equate to no less than genocide against black people, the watery vagaries of this statement are ultimately a violence. Now, in this over-the-top condemnation is what I consider to be a reasonable demand for the Poetry Foundation to write a meaningful statement that details the specific material ways in which it plans to work to eradicate institutional racism. What are the tangible actions that the foundation are going to take to back up these words? That's a fair enough request. The initial statement from the Poetry Foundation that I read to you was a bit light on details, and it's certainly would be reasonable to concerned parties to follow up and ask for specifics. But that's not how we're doing things anymore. Aggrieved parties don't negotiate, they don't accept apologies. They don't say, okay, good start, pretty words, but let's put some action behind those words. No, they say this lack of specificity is violent. It is a violent contribution to genocide, and the authors of it must be fired. You don't say, this podcast raises some interesting questions about the degree to which persistent racial inequalities seem linked to poor health outcomes for African Americans. No, you say all involved, all who think such a thought must lose their jobs for daring to suggest that socioeconomic factors may play a larger role than racism in poorer health outcomes. You don't say affirmative action requires some policy trade-offs that many people consider a violation of the right of every individual to equal treatment. So let's discuss how we can best promote equity and inclusion given that reality. No, you say a person with such a view cannot be allowed to speak. And to my story, you don't say, we'd like to discuss the most effective ways for reporters and opinion writers to cover controversies that arise over incidents in which the outcome is tragic for a person of color, but the details are still very unclear. No, you say all reporting and commentary that doesn't conform to the party line that cops are violent racists who want to murder black and brown children are themselves tantamount to violence. Even though the on-the-ground reporting in the aftermath showed that the residents of Little Village where this happened were divided in their views about the shooting. Even though I got email from hundreds of supportive readers, including John Rosales, a former member of the board of directors of the Little Village Chamber of Commerce, saying they shared my view of the situation and they applauded my caution. Even though by the time the police body cam was out and showed that Adam had discreetly tossed his gun behind a fence in the split second before he wheeled around with his empty hands up, creating a situation in which the officer was not in danger, but perceived that he was. Now, the shooting was unnecessary. The outcome was horrifying, but Cook County State's Attorney Kim Fox recently announced that it was not a crime. The officer was mistaken in thinking that Adam Toledo was still armed, but he made that mistake in 0.8 of a second. He feared he might pay with his life, and he was wrong. It was not a murder. I was right to issue that warning not to jump to conclusions. Finally, let me talk about the third camp, the whatabouters. Those who say Republicans and conservatives are far more aggressive and punitive when it comes to speech, and therefore a far greater threat to discourse than a bunch of extremely extra liberals. I think they make an excellent point. Long before they weaponized the term cancel culture, the political right has been enthusiastic in its attempts to ban, burn, and marginalize books, music, activists, and anything or anyone else they feel has stepped over some cultural or political lines. You want cancel culture? Try the McCarthy-era blacklist. Try the moral majority founder Jerry Falwell and his 1999 effort to take the Teletubbies off public TV because he thought Tinky Winky was gay. Try the 2003 country radio boycott of the band that known as the Dixie Chicks for criticizing President George W. Bush. Try the efforts of the conservatives to ban from the curriculum such books as Catcher in the Rye, The Grapes of Wrath, Slaughterhouse-Five, the Harry Potter novels, and Beloved, to name just a few titles. Try the efforts of former President Trump to end the careers of Bill Maher, Chris Matthews, Katie Tur, Paul Krugman, Chuck Todd, Kathleen Sebelius, Donald Brazil, and others. Try Trump's futile calls for boycotts of companies he felt had crossed or disrespected him, including Apple, Harley-Davidson, Nabisco, Rolling Stone, Univision, and Macy's. Think of how Trump tried in 2017 to have San Francisco 49ers quarterback Colin Kaepernick fired or suspended for kneeling during the national anthem to protest police violence against black people. Think how NFL owners went along with that effort and have since kept him out of the league. Or just take a look at the demands on the right these days that teachers not be allowed to dwell on America's ugly history with race, but instead be forced to inculcate students with something called patriotic history that glosses over the unsavory elements in our collective past and promotes a shallow jingoism. Members of school boards across this country have been subjected to harassment and threats for not towing the conservative line in the teaching of race, or the wearing of masks to help prevent the spread of COVID-19. And for talking about attempting to deny people a voice, let's talk about the massive and transparent efforts to hamper voting rights in state after state. The indignation, the vitriol, the bitter accusations, and the threats aimed at those whose views are seen as threatening do, yes, sometimes cause them to be fired or prompt them to resign. Other targets simply lose income. But the real point of the organized obloquy from the far left and the far right is not to harm the reputation or job prospect of the individual. Many of the victims are actually quite fine. Author J.K. Rowling, who's been persistently criticized for not being fully on board with the trans agenda, will always have more money than God and a huge audience for whatever she writes. Comedian Dave Chappelle will also be fine. So will I. I chose not to participate in this tough times for local journalism panel out of respect for my former colleagues and other people on the panel who are volunteering to give up a weeknight and deserve not to have this panel derailed by some ridiculous protest. Instead, I told my story to my 20,000 readers of the Picayune Sentinel. But that didn't matter to them because the goal was not to silence me. The main goal, the main purpose of these forms of cancellation is to strike fear into the hearts of those who have opinions, reasonable, thoughtful, even majority opinions that cut against groupthink. Those people who are comparatively powerless, who don't have tenure, supportive supervisors, or bank accounts that can sustain them through periods where they are deemed too controversial to employ. The main point is to intimidate them into silence. It's preemptive deterrence. It quietly silences dozens, scores, hundreds of people whose names you will never hear because they'll never dare to draw attention to themselves. So to consider one more Chicago area story, the story last fall about McDonald's CEO Chris Kempczynski, whose private texts to Mayor Lori Lightfoot surfaced during an FOIA request. He mentioned to the mayor the shooting deaths of Adam Toledo and 7-year-old Jocelyn Adams, who was collateral damage in an attempted gang hit at a West Side McDonald's. And he said, quote, "The parents failed those kids, which I know is something you can't say," the CEO of McDonald's said to Mayor Lightfoot. Activists branded him as an ignorant racist, and he squeaked out an apology for not having shown empathy and compassion. And he's talking about a text meant for one person. Somehow, typing with his thumbs, not even using proper punctuation, he neglected to fully contextualize the comprehensive social pathologies that parents have to battle in these disadvantaged communities. And he therefore blasted over a blunt opinion without any nuance behind it. And the angry opportunists jumped on it as though it were a fully fleshed out position paper that reflected not just his views, but his corporation's views. And those of you who've never dashed off a thought in private communication or conversation that would make you look bad if reprinted in the papers should feel free to get up on your high horse and wag your finger at Chris Kempczynski. But the rest of us should try to have that difficult and even at times painful conversation about the undeniable role of parental influences on the young, good and bad, and how we might improve them, how we might help parents on the front end instead of blaming them on the back end. It's a difficult conversation to have without recrimination, without shaming, without piling on, without loaded accusations, without name calling. And I hope I haven't disappointed you by stopping here and not listing more examples of people who have experienced that peril directly, not just on college campuses, but in publications and corporations, public schools, town halls. I have more, I've written about more, but we do not have all evening. In conclusion, if you're among those who think there is only one side that gets to safely express opinions on important controversial issues, then you and I differ. If you don't see that this issue, like so many others I've touched on, are legitimately debatable, issues that people of goodwill should be able to discuss in the spirit of intellectual inquiry, then I think you're part of the problem. You're part of the reason that the public discourse has become increasingly perilous. You're part of the reason that our society is so polarized right now, so unable to find common ground, so willing to see politics and policy as a zero-sum game. Now, a policy proposal that I believe will amplify voices of moderation, common sense, and reduce the power of the loud members of the fringe is nonpartisan primaries and ranked choice voting. Right now, political candidates are incentivized to appeal to the staunchest members of their own parties, the ones who are most likely to come out and vote during primary elections. So general elections often come down to winner-take-all battles pitting people representing the most extreme views against one another, with people who have moderate and compromised positions being pushed off the table. And I think here of someone like Adam Kinzinger, who is the Republican congressman. I don't know if he represent this area or not.
He did.
Still doesn't he?
No.
No, oh, yeah, he's shifted around. And he finds that he has absolutely no chance. I think that if you were to get him into a general election in Illinois, that Adam Kinzinger might do pretty well for governor or senator, but there's no chance he's going to make it through a Republican primary. So he realized that and he bowed out. And I think that's a shame. I don't agree with Adam Kinzinger about a lot of things, but I do respect him a great deal for the courage that he's shown, the statements that he's made. He's someone who's just absolutely pushed off the edge of the table. If you had open primaries, they would whittle the final choice down to 2, 3, or 4 top vote getters, then followed by a ranked choice general election, where you would choose your favorite candidates and you try to find ultimately the majority position. That would certainly result in candidates with broad general appeal who know how to work with one another and lower the temperature of our politics. Getting rid of gerrymandering nationwide is a very promising idea. I have no hope for that happening. It's not easy. Now, if you're not afraid of debate, of hearing and engaging with views that differ from your own, you should speak out for such ideas. You should speak out when you see the intolerant, extreme forces of cancellation agitating or threatening and trying to silence not just those who have spoken, but those who might someday speak. Write to the papers, the magazines, the journals, the administrators. Get on social media yourself. Defend the expression of ideas that you don't agree with, but meet them with arguments, not insults. Replace consequence culture with counterpoint culture. Set examples, don't make them. And that's all I got to say. I really appreciate
Any more questions?
I got a question. I was going to say that with respect to politics, it seems to me that campaigning is different than governing. They campaign to got to get elected. The gerrymanders, they change the districts, Republicans and Democrats, to make sure the candidates, at least their candidates, get more votes. And I'm just thinking that once they get in office, then they have to govern. And to me, that's somewhat of a problem. Not a problem, but it's different. It's not the same as saying my opponent's a racist. Now you have to deal with that opponent's racist to govern. And it's just different.
Well, there's certainly no shortage of examples of candidates who make promises and then get elected.
Well, yeah. They get elected because 25 or 30%.
I never knew the budget was this bad. I have to raise taxes. Yeah.
I'm sorry?
I said I never knew the budget was this bad. I have to raise taxes. That's true. Are there other questions I've got this written down up here. So, what do we do about fake news? How do we recognize it? How do we counteract it? That's a great question. And there's certainly these fact check organizations like PolitiFact and factcheck.org that try to keep news organizations handy. I'm discouraged these days about how easily people want to accept lies and how easy it is to persuade them of something that's absolutely false. And there's been talk about, why aren't the people of Russia rising up against this awful campaign of war crimes and brutality, inhumanity in Ukraine? And the answer is that the Russian propaganda machine is humming along and people are buying it. I think the way to recognize any sort of fake news is to read broadly, watch broadly. If you're a Fox News person, you should watch MSNBC or CNN. And if you're an MSNBC watcher, you should watch a little Fox. I think those are fairly extreme. I think you can find some moderate or some more mainstream, but I think it really pays to check out. If you hear a story, you might want to check other sources. Counteracting it, I don't know. Another question is here, what do you see as the future of print newspapers? Oh boy. I think the future of print newspapers is fairly bleak. I have 3 adult children, none of them open or read print newspapers and have for a long time, even when their lovely father has written wonderful columns. You would never see them touching a print product. When I first moved into my neighborhood in Chicago 30 years ago, just about every house had at least one paper delivered on the doorstep. This was before the internet really took off. Now, the newspaper delivery person comes down and throws maybe 3 papers on the porches, on the street. And I think those are mostly legacy readers, people who, for whom newspapers have always been a habit. But I don't think that habit is at all catching on among youth in colleges, in high schools, that people don't do that. And I like newspapers fine. I think I am more sentimental about and worried about the organization. And let's talk about the Tribune. I don't worry about the idea that the Tribune won't necessarily publish a print product that will kill a bunch of trees and land on your porch 8 or 9 hours after the news gets made. I think that what's important to me is not the physical product. What's important to me is what that organization does, what it means, what the Sun-Times means, what WBEZ and Cranes and these organizations do, and who they cover, and how they hold to account our politicians, and how they tell you what's really going on in the investigation of Michael Madigan or all the corrupt aldermen we have in town. But you need those people there, and how their information is delivered is not as important to me as the fact that it is being generated and is available. I think that almost all of this news will be online, and that the various products for reading it will be online, and the print newspapers will begin to vanish. And there are places now where they are only published, like my hometown of Ann Arbor. There's, I think the paper publishes twice a week. It publishes every day online, but it only is delivered twice a week. It's only printed and delivered twice a week. I believe that that's becoming more and more true in cities, and I think it's going to start happening in Chicago as well. That some of these news organizations are going to be publishing only once a week. But what's going to keep these news organizations, let's not call them newspapers anymore, let's call them news organizations, what's going to keep them going are digital subscriptions and advertising. Advertising is a harder and harder sell because there's so many ways that advertisers can reach people now. And that it may end up being that we're going to have to adopt a philanthropic, not-for-profit model for some of these major papers. You've already seen in Chicago the Sun-Times and WBEZ have combined. I don't know if you follow that news at all, but WBEZ, this little small, once tiny little public radio station that was operating in the 41st floor of the Bankers Building, and that my wife was working there when I first met her. It's this humble little place is now a news behemoth in town. It's like the second-rated radio station or first, depending on the ratings period, and it's big enough that it bought the Chicago Sun-Times, which when I first came to town was, of course, this enormous tabloid that published every day, 100 pages or so every day. So we've had this inversion. A electronic broadcast digital news outlet has purchased this legacy print operation, and the transition has been greased by significant contributions from the charitable community. And I think that that's going to be what we're going to start seeing news organizations, news outlets be considered to be civic assets the way a ballet or a symphony or a museum is. That it doesn't have to just get by on the revenue that comes straight in the door, but it's by on raising profits. You've already seen the Salt Lake Tribune is not for profit, and we're seeing that more and more. So that's where I think it's going. So it's a very long answer to a short question. Are there other questions or things you want to ask about? Tribune gossip or something? Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on the minister in Oak Park who came out and expressed to his congregation that they should, over the Easter Holy Week and Easter time period, disregard whiteness?
Yeah, the story is about there's a Methodist church in Oak Park that posted a sign, and for Lent, the sign said, "We are fasting from whiteness." It's basically a white congregation, and this hit the national news. People were very indignant about it, and my thought, and what they meant by that was that they were going to not use liturgical music from white composers during Lent. They were only going to use liturgical music that was composed by people of color, black composers, and so on. And this was their way of making a statement. I thought that the statement itself, let me put it this way. I think the effort itself was great. It was fine. To broaden your musical horizons, to platform this kind of music for 40 days is not a particularly radical thing, but it could be very eye-opening. There is wonderful music that doesn't get played because people don't think of it or they don't know it. Great idea. A great idea also to ponder a little bit the fact that we do get into our ruts and our comfort zones and we don't look outside that, and that we should consider that there's art, there's culture, there's things that we would really enjoy if we would, like I said, get out of our comfort zone. I thought that idea was a good idea. I thought the slogan itself, fasting from whiteness, was very problematic. First of all, when you're fasting from something, you're abstaining from something that you're depriving yourself of something that you want, and you're not eating meat, for instance. So you really like meat, but you're not eating meat for Lent. You're not smoking for Lent. You really like smoking, but you're not going to smoke, so you're going to have you're going to suffer. Well, if the idea is that you're suffering, this is a bad thing to be listening to liturgical music from other cultures. That sort of goes against what fasting is all about, because this is great music you're listening to. The other thing is that you can't fast from whiteness. You can't not be white for 40 days. That whiteness, I believe that whiteness does and has long, white privilege is a real thing in our society, that a lot of advantages that you have had growing up in a society where whiteness has been advantaged are there. And it pays to think about that, but when you put it in terms of fasting from whiteness, you make people think that you're trying to shame them or make them feel guilty. And I think that's where a lot of the reaction came from. So that if I'd been advising a church, I'd say, let's have a slogan that's not designed to get people really mad.
Well, when you live in a town such as Kankakee, and you don't know that that's a white congregation with a white minister, and you don't know the background that caused that statement to be made in the first place.
Yeah. No, I thought it was, I understood what he was doing. I thought what the pastor was doing. I thought that the slogan was so provocative as to be almost trollish. That would have been, they should have worked a little harder at that slogan, because I think that it didn't, and I say that only because I think it didn't accomplish what they wanted to accomplish, was to sort of really raising some people's consciousness and making them feel better about this diversity, equity, inclusion. A lot of people felt like it was really polarizing, that it was driving people apart. And that wasn't the point, but I think that the slogan did that. So a swing and a miss, maybe.